Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Dollmaker's Secret. Holly Arnold had always been drawn to the macabre. Her fascination with the eerie led her to collect antique dolls' porcelain faces frozen in time, their glass eyes forever wide, watching. It was an obsession that had taken her across the world, seeking rare and unique pieces for her collection. But nothing had ever unsettled her quite like the dolls she discovered on a chilly, overcast afternoon in a small shop tucked away on the Isle of Wight. The shop had been there for centuries, hidden from the view of tourists, known only to a select few who were in search of things strange and forgotten. It was called the Dollmaker's Curse. Holly found it by accident, lured in by a faded sign creaking in the wind. The shopkeeper, a man as ancient as the dust that clung to every corner of the store, greeted her with a crooked smile. His eyes sparkled with a knowing look, as though he had been expecting her. "What are you looking for, Miss Arnold?" he asked, his voice raspy, barely more than a whisper. "Something special," she replied, brushing past old wooden shelves that creaked under the weight of their unusual inventory. "Something rare," the old man nodded and disappeared behind a dusty curtain at the back of the shop. Moments later he returned holding a porcelain doll unlike any Holly had ever seen. It was small, delicate, and entirely unsettling. The doll's face was pale and flawless, save for a faint crack running down one cheek. Its eyes were large and unnervingly lifelike, their glassy blue depths capturing the light in a way that seemed almost unnatural. The doll's clothes were faded but intricately detailed, a miniature Victorian gown complete with lace and tiny buttons. "This one," the shopkeeper rasped, "has a secret." Holly's heart raced as she held the doll in her hands. The weight was off, heavier than it should have been. There was something hidden inside, something she could feel but not yet see. She glanced at the shopkeeper, who gave her a sly grin. She belonged to a dollmaker, one of the last in a long line. Some say she made a deal with something dark to craft such perfection. Take her if you dare, but be warned what's inside may not be to your liking. The word stirred something deep inside Holly, fear, excitement, and curiosity all woven together in a tight knot. She purchased the doll without another word, and by dusk she was back in her small, ivy-covered cottage overlooking the rugged cliffs of the Isle of Wight. She placed the doll on her work table, the fading light from the setting sun casting long shadows over her collection. The doll sat there, still and silent, its cracked porcelain face tilted ever so slightly as if it were listening. Holly examined the doll more closely, running her fingers over the crack on its cheek. The hairline fissure felt rough, unlike the smooth finish of the rest of the doll. That's when she noticed it, a barely visible seam along the back of the doll's neck. Her pulse quickened. This was no ordinary doll. With trembling hands, she fetched a small tool and carefully pried open the seam. Inside, hidden in a hollow compartment, was a brittle, yellowed piece of paper, folded tightly. Holly unfolded it with great care, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words scrawled in an elegant but erratic script. "She watches while you sleep, waiting for the promise to keep. Once the secret's in your hand, blood and soul shall feed the land." A shiver crept down Holly's spine. She felt a cold breeze, though none of the windows were open. The room grew darker, shadows thickening in every corner. The doll, still motionless on the table, seemed to be watching her, its eyes following her every move. Holly shook off the creeping dread and forced herself to look away from the doll. The cryptic message weighed heavy in her mind. Who had written it? And what did it mean? Determined to uncover the truth, she delved into the history of the dollmaker. Her research led her to a woman named Marjorie Blythe, a reclusive artisan who had lived in a small village on the Isle of Wight centuries ago. Marjorie had been known for her exquisite dolls, perfect in every detail. But rumors surrounded her work. People whispered that her dolls were cursed, that they moved on their own, that they held the souls of the dead. When children who owned her dolls began to vanish, the villagers turned against her. One stormy night, they stormed her home and burned it to the ground with her inside. But her dolls, they survived. Over the next few days, Holly became obsessed with the doll and its secrets. The cryptic message played over and over in her mind, filling her with unease. She began hearing things in the dead of night, soft whispers, faint footsteps, the creak of floorboards when no one was there. And always, always, the doll's glassy blue eyes seemed to follow her every move. Sleep became impossible. Whenever Holly closed her eyes, she felt a presence in the room, something watching her from the shadows. She would wake up drenched in cold sweat, the doll sitting on the table across the room, its cracked face illuminated by the dim moonlight. One night, Holly awoke to the sound of soft humming. It was coming from the corner of the room. Her heart pounded as she reached for the lamp, flicking it on. The light cast harsh shadows across the room, but the doll was no longer on the table. It was sitting on the floor, closer to her bed, its head tilted, its glass eyes glinting in the faint light. Holly's breath hitched. She hadn't moved the doll. She knew she hadn't. Terrified, she grabbed the doll and threw it into the small wooden trunk at the foot of her bed, slamming the lid shut. She locked it, and for the first time in days, she managed to fall asleep. But it wasn't over. That night, Holly had a nightmare. She was in Marjorie Blythe's workshop, surrounded by dolls, hundreds of them, all watching her with unblinking eyes. In the center of the room stood the Dollmaker herself, her face twisted in rage, her hands reaching out for Holly. "You've broken the seal," Marjorie hissed. "Now you must pay the price." Holly woke with a scream. The room was freezing, her breath visible in the air. She sat up, her eyes immediately drawn to the trunk at the foot of the bed. The lock had been shattered, the lid open, and the doll was gone. Panic surged through her. She scrambled out of bed, searching the room, but there was no sign of the doll. Her mind raced ahead. She imagined it. Was she losing her grip on reality? Then she heard it, the faintest sound, like porcelain scraping against wood. Slowly her gaze drifted to the far corner of the room. The doll was standing there, upright, its head tilted, its eyes fixed on her. Holly's heart stopped. She backed away, her hands trembling. The doll took a single step forward, its tiny porcelain foot tapping against the floor. "Oh," Holly whispered, backing up toward the door. "If this isn't real," but the doll moved again. It raised its tiny arm, pointing directly at her. The room grew colder, the shadows darker, and Holly could hear the faintest whisper echoing in the air. "Her blood and soul shall feed the land." Holly fled the room. She had to leave, to escape whatever curse she had unleashed. But as she reached the front door, she froze. The doll was there, sitting on the threshold, its cracked face grinning up at her. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an unnatural hum. Holly's vision blurred, a body growing heavy, her legs buckling beneath her. She collapsed to the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And then silence. When Holly's eyes fluttered open, she was no longer in her cottage. She was lying on the cold, hard ground of an unfamiliar place. Above her, the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the barren landscape. She struggled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. Around her were dolls. Hundreds of them, all scattered across the land, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight. And in the distance, standing on a hill, was Marjorie Blythe. "She watches while you sleep," Marjorie whispered. "And now you are hers." The dolls began to move, slowly at first. They surrounded Holly, their eyes filled with malice, their mouths open in silent screams. And as the moon dipped below the horizon, Holly Arnold disappeared into the night, her final scream swallowed by the wind, leaving nothing behind but the empty shell of a doll. To this day, locals on the Isle of Wight speak of a haunted doll that still roams the cliffs, searching for a new soul to claim. And if you listen closely on a stormy night, you can hear the faint whispers of a dollmaker's secret waiting for the next collector to take it home. The legend of Holly Arnold's disappearance spread quickly across the Isle of Wight, though most dismissed it as mere folklore. Yet there were those who knew better, locals who remembered strange occurrences and whispered tales of the cursed dollmaker Marjorie Blythe. They warned travelers to stay away from the cliffs near Holly's cottage, especially on stormy nights. Weeks after Holly's disappearance, the cottage remained eerily silent, untouched by time. Her belongings were left exactly as she had abandoned them, dust slowly settling over her doll collection. No one dared to enter the house, not even the bravest of souls, until one misty morning when an investigator named Richard Holloway arrived on the island. Richard was no stranger to strange cases. He had been called to the isle by Holly's sister, who had grown increasingly worried after hearing nothing from her for weeks. Holly was known for her eccentricity, but radio silence from her was unusual. Desperate for answers, her sister had hired Richard, a former detective turned paranormal investigator, to find out what had happened. The locals were reluctant to help him. Many refused to speak of the events, muttering about curses and evil spirits, but one old fisherman pointed Richard toward the Dollmaker's curse, the shop where Holly had purchased the fateful doll. The shop was as strange as Holly had described. Richard stepped inside, the musty thick with age. The shopkeeper, the same elderly man who had sold Holly the doll, watched Richard closely from behind the counter. I know why you're here." His voice was heavy with foreboding. "You see, cancer is about the girl. You knew Holly Arnold. She came here, just like you, driven by curiosity, but she found something she shouldn't have." The shopkeeper gestured toward a shelf behind him. His gnarled fingers hovered over one spot, an empty space where a doll had once stood. If she took the last of Marjorie Blythe's creations. The doll that carries a piece of Marjorie's soul. Of Marjorie Blythe, the Dollmaker. Her soul was bound to the dolls. They were her children, her creations, but when the villagers turned on her, she cursed them, cursed her dolls to carry her legacy of vengeance. Holly unleashed that curse. Now, it's too late. At least, he hadn't before now. But something in the shopkeeper's eyes made him pause. There was an intensity there, a haunted look that only came from seeing something beyond the natural world. Richard asked, though he dreaded the answer. The shopkeeper's face darkened. Gone, trapped in the space between life and death, acclaimed by Marjorie's curse. She will never return, determined. The wind whipped across the cliffs as he approached, the sea crashing violently against the rocks below. The air was thick with moisture, the storm clouds above swirling ominously. The cottage itself seemed frozen in time, just as Holly had left it. Richard pushed open the door, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the house was cold and dark, and an overwhelming sense of dread hung in the air. The dolls, dozens of them, lined the shelves and tables, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. Richard examined the room carefully, searching for any clues as to Holly's fate. The note, the one she had found inside the doll, was still there on her work table. He read it aloud, the cryptic words filling the silence. "She watches while you sleep, waiting for the promise to keep. Once the secret's in your hand, blood and soul shall feed the land." There was a presence in the room, something unseen yet deeply unsettling. Suddenly he heard a faint sound, a soft humming, like a child's lullaby. It was coming from the next room. Richard cautiously followed the sound, his heart pounding. The door to Holly's bedroom was ajar, and as he pushed it open, he froze in horror. There, standing in the center of the room, was a doll. The same porcelain doll with the cracked face and unsettlingly lifelike eyes. But it was no longer just sitting idly. Its tiny head was turned toward him, and its cracked mouth was slightly open, as if it were humming. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He slowly backed away, but as he did, the doll took a step toward him. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it was struggling to control its own body. "Ah," Richard whispered, the realization dawning on him. This was no ordinary doll. It was a vessel, a prison for the soul of the cursed Dollmaker. The doll's glass eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment Richard swore he saw something human, a flicker of life, of consciousness trapped inside. The air in the room grew impossibly cold, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe as if they were alive. Suddenly, the doll lunged at him, its small porcelain hands reaching for his throat. Richard stumbled backward, knocking over a table as he tried to escape. The doll's grip was impossibly strong for something so small, and he felt its cold fingers wrap around his neck. With a desperate shout, Richard tore the doll away and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening crack, its porcelain body shattering into pieces. But as the shards hit the floor, something dark and unnatural began to seep from the cracks, a swelling black mist, thick and oily, filling the room with the stench of decay. The mist coalesced, forming the shape of a woman, Marjorie Blythe, her ghostly figure towering over him. Her eyes burned with hatred, her twisted smile revealing a row of jagged teeth. "You will not escape," she hissed. "Blood and soul shall feed the land. You are too late." Just as she was, Richard scrambled for the door. But as he turned to flee, he felt the cold grip of Marjorie's presence around him, pulling him into the darkness. The last thing he saw was the twisted face of the doll, grinning at him from the shadows, its cracked porcelain smile wide and sinister. Days later, the villagers found Holly's cottage abandoned once again. The door hung open, swaying in the wind, but there was no sign of Richard Holloway. His disappearance was added to the growing list of strange occurrences on the Isle of Wight, the legend of the cursed Dollmaker growing ever darker. But deep in the cliffs, beneath the grey skies and howling winds, Marjorie Blythe's curse remained waiting, always waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon the Dollmaker's secret. And if you listen closely, on stormy nights near the cliffs, you can still hear the faint sound of a lullaby, carried on the wind. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.